Now, this goes back to, again, the point of this and the underlying creepiness of this goes back to that corporate government amalgamation that I talked about earlier and that I've talked about in many different aspects here on the Corporate Report podcast, perhaps most notably back in episode 227 on the regulation trap, and in film literature and the New World Order number 35 on Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, about the founding of the FDA and the fact that there was heavy corporate influence in the foundation of that particular governmental monopoly. And unfortunately, the entire history of U.S. government involvement in what people are eating is no exception to those rules. And we can find more details on this, quite specifically from a pamphlet by Josh Suter called A Brief History of Food, Nutrition, and Government Policy in America that is available for free up online. It's not a voluminous read, and I suggest you do read it because it goes into the specific details of this story from the early part of the 20th century right up till today in a lot of detail, and it's worth reading. Just reading from the opening of that particular treatise, it says, "Government intrusion is often obvious. We know when government taxes our income, stops us from using our drug of choice, or when they kick down our door and throw us in a cage. But sometimes, government actions are more subtle and confusing. It's often tempting to blame industry alone for the failures in the market and to ignore the substantial, but often less visible role that government plays in regulating different markets. From the housing crisis and its relationship to banking, to healthcare and sky-high costs, this tends to ring true. When it comes to food, nutrition, and its impact on health, blame is often allocated against the market by the uninformed individual. The average person tends to vaguely understand the issue. They probably know a bit about farm subsidies, taxes, and the food pyramid. However, they most likely don't understand the level at which government regulates our food. There is a long and storied history of government agriculture policy, import tariffs, food quotas, shoddy science guidelines, and regulation, all of which gets passed over for more obvious scapegoats, such as the market and corporations." End quote. Now, I think that passage brings in the subject, although I would stress and emphasize for anyone on the left who's horrified to hear it's government to blame and not the corporations. No, they're equally to blame. The corporations and the government work together at that level. I think that's an important part of this. It is a fascist matrix. It's the wedding of corporate and government power in a monopoly power, the government, which has the monopoly stick that it wields to, unfortunately, great effect. Now, let's skip through. As I say, this is a big pamphlet that goes right through the 20th century and all of the various incarnations of U.S. dietary and guidelines and food tariffs and agricultural acts and other things. But let's skip ahead to the food pyramid, and we'll read from the section specifically dealing with that. Suter writes, quote, "In 1991, Secretary of Agriculture Edward Madigan announced that the nearly complete federal food guide pyramid would be postponed. Though his official reason was that the pyramid would be confusing to children, it seems far more likely that he was responding to political pressure of groups like the National Cattlemen's Association, who had been vocal about the placement of the beef and meat food group in the pyramid. The pyramid had been in development for nearly 10 years under the supervision of nutrition professor Louise Light. Light had been tasked with updating the government's Basic 4 food guide, which had been released in 1956 as a replacement for the Basic 7. The goal was to create something that went much further than basic food recommendations. Light and her team of nutritionists aimed to remove foods that they saw as unhealthy. Her guide kept sugar below 10% of daily calories and limited refined carbohydrates and kept grains at a maximum of 2 to 3 servings per day, preferably in whole grain form. Light and her team encouraged 5 to 9 servings of fruit and veggies and recommended quality proteins like eggs and nuts. Good fat sources like olive oil and flaxseed were also encouraged. Generally satisfied with their well-researched guidelines, Light and her team submitted the pyramid for review. Unfortunately, her guide was rejected and swapped out with dramatically altered guidelines to the point that one might be justified in wondering why they even bothered to hire someone to create such a guide, only to almost completely ignore it. Denise Minger shed some light on the changes to the pyramid in Death by Food Pyramid. The guide Light and her team worked so hard to assemble came back a mangled, lopsided perversion of its former self. The recommended grain servings had nearly quadrupled, exploding to form America's dietary centerpiece. 6 to 11 servings of grains per day replaced Light's recommended 2 to 3, and rather than aggressively lowering sugar consumption as Light's team strived to do, the new guidelines told Americans to choose a diet moderate in sugar, with no explanation of what that hazy phrase actually meant. Light was shocked and horrified by the changes. Despite her best attempts, she wasn't able to get her version of the pyramid approved. She was never given any justification for why the guidelines were changed, other than being told that healthy food was too expensive and that people on food stamps couldn't afford it. The USDA largely recognized grains to be interchangeable with fruit and vegetables from a nutritional perspective and didn't see any significant problems with their version of the pyramid. Light went on to write a book about the whole ordeal in 2006. Ultimately, the pyramid was released in 1992 and no significant changes were made in between the time that Madigan postponed the pyramid and the time that he finally approved it. However, significant amounts of money and time were spent attempting to improve the project anyway. There only were a few cosmetic changes, such as the style of noodles in the picture were altered along with the color of the chopsticks. The food pyramid was thus approved and published in multiple educational texts and posters. It was slapped on cereal boxes nationwide and often marketed towards children with a nice government endorsement for cereal grains. We'll end the quote there. As I say, this is a very in-depth pamphlet, so I will put the link in the show notes, and I do encourage you to read through it. It has many, many more specific examples throughout the past century of U.S. government interference in the daily eating habits of the average American. But talking about this entire subject and its deeper implications, Josh Suter appeared on IITV a couple of years ago.
So when I was a kid, they showed me the pyramid of what you're supposed to eat, grains and meats and vegetables, with sugar on top and wheat down below. Of course, as an Italian, you kind of flip that around. I just had more sugar. But where did this come from? Why do we even have it? Josh Suter wrote an interesting paper for the Foundation for Economic Education, great organization. Why were you curious in the history of the food pyramid?
So I feel like this is very misrepresented by most people. Most people don't really understand what has gone into this, and they like to blame corporations, which certainly aren't innocent, but the government plays a very large role in this.
You mean that the government was a tool of big corporations to get you to eat the products that big corporations want you to eat?
That's part of it, yeah. I mean, lobbyists essentially...
Any truth to that?
Say again?
Any truth to that?
Yeah, there's some truth to that. I mean, lobbyists play a large role in government in general, but especially in the food industry. You could go back to companies like Archer Daniels Midland. Dwayne Andreas was one of the most well-connected lobbyists in probably the history of America. He funded both sides of the aisle for years and years. He was involved in a large price-fixing scheme with his company. His son actually went to jail. The movie The Informant, starring Matt Damon, is actually about his company and the massive amount of corruption that they went through. But
so when did the pyramid start? I remember it as a kid. When was it created?
So there's a lot going on there. So basically, the McGovern Commission was sort of the predecessor to the food pyramid. So that was Senator George McGovern. He got involved in that in the early 70s, and then they released their findings in 79. So sometime around that, they started with the creation of the pyramid.
They being the FDA?
FDA was not so much involved. This was more USDA and the Department of Health, and eventually it became just the USDA.
Okay.
So a lot of it was based off McGovern's work, which was based off a scientist named Ansel Keys, who did a whole bunch of studies. He did his famous 7-country study and the 6-country analysis. So he did those, which led to McGovern. McGovern did all of his research, and then the USDA started creating the food pyramid. They wanted something fun and simple that they could sell. I don't know if they were aiming at children, but that's certainly what ended up happening. So the actual pyramid came out in 91.
91?
Yeah, it took them a long time to actually finish it.
Then what did I see when I was a kid? I could have sworn I saw the food pyramid as a grade school kid.
You're probably,
in the 70s.
My guess would be looking at I believe it was the famous 4 or the 4 or the 7. I forget the term, but they had the 4 food groups. That's what it was.
Yes.
In the 1950s, yes. And then that was later changed to 7, or actually reverse that, 7 then 4.
Right, so let me ask you, when they made this pyramid, did they get it right? And isn't that a completely subjective thing? I mean, the idea that the government will know what the right diet is when everybody has different opinions on it. How do you even judge if they got it right?
So that's kind of the time-old question. Nutrition is one of the most subjective in the sense that everyone is looking at different research. You got your vegans, you got your paleo, keto. They all have dramatically different views on it. And a lot of them are looking at the same science that has been interpreted differently. So overall, I would say no, the government did not get it right. They got it probably about as wrong as they could have. But there still are a lot of things that are still being debated even now.
Once again, Josh Suter discussing his attempts to document the history of food, nutrition, and government policy in America. Now, I suppose we've reached the point of the podcast where it may be a question in the minds of some of the listeners. Well then, James, what should we be eating? Or what shouldn't we be eating? Or there may be, I'm sure there are many people in the audience who are more than eager to tell us all what you have to eat or what you cannot eat or things along those lines. And if that is the point at which we've arrived, then I have signally failed in my duties as a podcast host today, because the point of today's episode is not to give you specific nutritional guidelines or to warn you against this or that in particular, although I'm sure you can go into the show notes and look at some of the various things that I've linked and come to some of your own conclusions about these, but that is the point. To come to some of your own conclusions after having done some research on some of these issues and research more than simply relying on choosemyplate.gov. Please, government master, tell me what I should be eating. The whole point of this is that when we forsake our own responsibility to ourselves and to our family to do basic research and basic due diligence about what it is that we should or should not be putting in our bodies to reach our own goals, because everyone has different goals and some people were willing to sacrifice this in order to gain that. The point is, when we forsake that and we put it into some central planning administrative body, that trough of power will immediately be monopolized by people who are looking to make their riches from using that trough of power. That is government. That is exactly what it is. That is exactly what it does. That is exactly what it is intended to do. And that stick will always and forever, as long as it exists, be wielded to corral people where certain people want the population to go. And that is really the point of this episode, and that's something to ponder the next time you encounter the food pyramid, the food plate, whatever they come up with next, whatever nutritional guidelines and advice, or the next time you hear a breaking news headline about a new study says that this food that you eat every day is killing you, or this food that you really want to eat every day, but you've been starving yourself of, well, that actually is great for you, or whatever they do to flip everything you've ever been told on its head tomorrow. Perhaps you can do a little bit more due diligence and research for yourself before simply taking any of this advice at face value, and that will go some way towards breaking the staff that enables such things as the sugar conspiracy to be conjured into existence.